Welcome to Australian basketball history. Why don't we start with your name, where you're based and how long you've been involved in basketball.
Yes, thanks George, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and the people you're communicating to. My name is Bob Elphinston, 83 years of age, now fully retired, had a wonderful life in terms of sport in particular, but basketball has been my passion and continues to be, and it's a delight to be here and particularly talk to you about the great things in sport and particularly Masters basketball.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us, Bob. One of the nicknames which you're known by is Elpho. It's perhaps a nickname that hasn't really been used much since the time that you were managing the Boomers, but is it okay to refer to you as Elpho today?
Yeah, I think many times my players and so on, others generally have trouble with my surname, Elphinston, being a bit long. And so Elpho became the acronym that it was easy for them, and that's one I respect and enjoy.
Well, Elpho, you're renowned for the contribution that you've made to the development of basketball across the world, particularly during your career and trajectory in basketball. But the peak period for you was really the times that you spent with FIBA, both as president of Oceania as well as globally. You've made a much bigger contribution to sport than just basketball, and of course the penultimate achievement for you was being on the bid team for the Sydney 2000 Olympics, being appointed as SOCOG's head of sport, and then of course being recognised by the IOC. So we're keen to talk to you about all of that, and we're also keen to find out about what you're doing these days, how your family is and your plans for the future. If I could wind the clock forward for a moment before we walk down memory lane, it'd be great to get your reflection on Masters sports in general. Australian athletes are preparing for two events right now. The first event is the World Masters Games, which will be held in Taiwan in late May of this year. Bob, you're on the board of the World Masters Games organising body. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the global Masters basketball movement.
Yeah, I guess my inspiration came out of the Sydney Olympics, where I was responsible for all sport at the Sydney Olympics and a host of other things as well relating to the athletes. And to be fair, and I suppose I got global recognition for that. And so when the Sydney bid for and won the right to host the World Masters Games in 2009, the government who were backing the bid asked would I join the board, and I did. I became a board member and became the expert again in sport and games relationships and so on. And again, the World Masters Games organisation, IMGA, International Masters Games Association, liked what I did and enjoyed my role and how I was promoting Masters sport, and asked would I join the board of IMGA, which I did, and served on that board for 12 years before my term expired, and under the remodelling of their constitution, terms are limited, but it was a wonderful movement and I enjoyed every moment of it. I went to many World Masters Games, and whilst I never ever competed at a World Masters Games, I was absolutely in awe of what I saw when I saw the athletes participating in the different Masters Games events around the world. So I remain very committed to the Masters movement.
When it comes to World Masters Games, which nations are the best at it?
Well, it's interesting. I think certainly Australia is right up there. We've hosted, 3 times, I think, the World Masters Games. Melbourne back in 2002 and Sydney in 2009. And now, of course, we'll have Perth in 2029. So Australia's got a remarkable record in that regard, and participation in other individual sports Masters events as well. But as well as that, the Europeans, I think the Italians, the Greeks, the Russians, the Americans, the Canadians have always been very strong. And the movement is growing very much in Japan. And I think we'll see more and more of the Asian influence, which, as you'll know, is the next World Masters Games in Taiwan. And then after that also is Korea, as well as on the list of several of the Pan-Pacific events.
What are the things that Taiwan needs to get right as a sort of host nation?
I think the interesting thing with the Masters movement worldwide is that why does someone want to, because they all pay their own way. The Masters movement's fantastic in as much as it's self-funded by the participants. They pay a pretty substantial registration fee, and then have to pay the travel to get there, pay their own accommodation and so on. So financially it's a good deal for a host city. So the host city needs to provide good playing facilities, and we know if Australia gets the right to host an event in the future, again, that we will do a remarkable job in that way. We provide good facilities, good hospitality, great sightseeing, but also first-class basketball facilities, which means the playing facilities, the referees, things are important to someone who's involved in basketball.
The other event that Australian Masters is getting ready for is, of course, from a basketball perspective, the 17th World Maxi Basketball Championships, and that'll be held this year in Switzerland in late June, early July. Bob, you're not going to be happy with this statistic, but Australia is currently ranked 35th in the world after 17 World Maxi Basketball Championships. Perhaps you can reflect on FIBA's, understanding of Masters basketball and where the sport is today.
Yeah, and that disappoints me that Australia is 35th, and I'm sure in time to come we'll be much higher ranked in that regard, as we are, as you know, in regular FIBA events. We're the third ranked nation in the world pretty much, in every aspect of it, men, women, juniors and seniors. But FIBA has been interested in, and I, in my role as president, or first of all as vice president, I promoted the opportunity to maybe get involved in the Masters movement. And FIBA was very supportive, but again, it was a low priority. They had other things to do, and I supported that. And so I'm absolutely delighted that FIBA is now pursuing the opportunities to have actual FIBA Masters events around the world. And they're working with FIMBA to enhance their competitions and provide a vehicle for them to continue to be involved as well. So I always profit the saying, George, that basketball should be from the cradle to the grave. And FIBA have done a wonderful job of having mini basketball, which was basketball for 5-year-olds through to maybe 12-year-olds, and then all the others. But then it drops off after 30, 35 years of age. So to bring in the Masters movement would be incredibly valuable for FIBA in growing the numbers involved in formal basketball around the world.
Here in Australia, we need to, of course, take a bottom-up activist approach and lobby our state bodies and also our local associations. But there's also a lot more room for structure and strategy on the part of Basketball Australia. So what would you like to see happen in Australia to advance the sport and, of course, our world rankings?
Well, I've been working with a number of people here in Australia. Ned Coaten, the former president of Basketball Australia, is a very enthusiastic Masters participant, and he has the ear now of FIBA, and so we're working hard for a FIBA World event in different ways. But in turn, we also want the member federations, so in our case, Basketball Australia, to take an active role in promoting Masters basketball and trying to get each of its member associations through the state bodies actually formally conducting Masters competitions and recognise them as a valuable part of the sport. And I look forward to maybe some changes in that direction.
Yeah, fantastic, Bob. Why don't we wind the clock back to the start of your journey and your earliest sporting memory? You're born and bred in Lithgow, yes, and regret not ever having played basketball yourself. Is that correct?
That's good research. Yes, I was. My parents were both school teachers, and in those days, and working in the primary school system in the state system in New South Wales, they tended to be moved around. So we were in Lithgow, and that's where I was born. Actually, it was a good basketball city, not when I was there, because at age 2 I moved, our family moved to Lismore on the north coast and Grafton, and then ultimately to Sydney. So I've lived pretty much all my life in Sydney, but never had anything to do with basketball in the earlier days, which I now regret very much. I would dearly have loved to have played the game at a young age.
You did do some middle distance running, and then at some point Bruce Flick influenced you and you took up some basketball coaching. Take us back to that time.
Yes, I loved all sports and played all sports in my school time in Sydney. And I guess my leading sport was middle distance running, where I did quite well at the 800 metres, 1500 metres. But I realised after a period of time, when I got to about age 18, that I was not going to really get much further than where I was at. I was probably 5th or 6th ranked in New South Wales, but nowhere near good enough to make it the next step. And fortunately, I was a physical education student. learning to be a teacher in phys ed. And one of the things I had to do was get a certificate for refereeing in 3 different sports. And one of those sports I chose was basketball. And interestingly, the lecturer at the time was Sid Taylor, a great Australian basketball referee, now deceased unfortunately. But one of my close mates in that group was Paul Bertell, a great basketball guy. And the family of the Bertells is well known in New South Wales and Australia generally. But so I learnt to play basketball as a phys ed student. And then I've been fortunate that I've said, George, one of the things I've often said about my career is I've been in the right place at the right time. And so my first posting to a high school was at Hurstville Boys High School, where the science master was Les Goff, who was Australia's top referee at the time. He got me involved in coaching, which I had a good group of boys I was coaching there at Hurstville Boys High School. And then he got me involved in the New South Wales junior program and their annual camp at Narrabeen Lakes National Fitness Centre. And I got involved there and I was very enthusiastic and very willing to learn and I was embraced very much by the then 1956 Olympian Bruce Flick, who was one of the coaches and the captain of the New South Wales team. He liked what I did and what I offered. So he invited me to join their club, which was Paratels, Sydney's #1 team, as an assistant coach. I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And within 3 months, he said, Bob, I need to focus on my career. You're now going to be the head coach. And here I was with a team with 3 Olympians in there and some wonderful first-class players, head coach of Sydney Paratels, who were Sydney's top team for many years. We played in the old South East Conference back in the 60s. And that progressed, of course, to through district basketball in Sydney to the Bankstown basketball, where I then spent 25 years of my life very closely involved.
And Bob, at the time that you become associated with Bankstown, you also get very excited about leading a redevelopment project, inspired by what Lindsay Gaze had achieved in Melbourne with Albert Park, and also inspired by what Dr. John Rashke had done up in Newcastle. Take us back to the lead up of that big goal-setting time of your life, and then the redevelopment of Bankstown.
Yeah, no, as I got more and more involved in basketball in Sydney, and it's not only just as a coach of the Sydney Paratels, but in the administration of the sport, I led the movement in Sydney after having been to Adelaide and Melbourne and talked with people like Frank Angove and those in Adelaide, and Lindsay in particular in Melbourne, that we needed to move to an era of what we call district basketball as opposed to club basketball. So I said the end result was that Paratels became basically Bankstown, or Canterbury Bankstown at the time. And it was a very difficult time for a lot of old established clubs. Like the Lithuanians had a great presence, the YMCA had a presence, and other licensed clubs had a presence. And so they lost that identity as they moved into district basketball. But that's been a great success in Melbourne and in Adelaide. And I learned so much from Lindsay in particular, and those in Adelaide, and therefore, and through John Rashke, I soon became a member of the New South Wales Basketball Association's board, and enjoyed my time there. And of course, progressively, we realised that we needed facilities. And Bankstown, when I first got involved with them, were just playing at this tiny little school gym. And they desperately needed to have something much bigger. And I was very impressed with what Lindsay had done and was doing in Melbourne, and the remodelling of not only Albert Park, but more importantly, the district clubs that were being developed throughout Melbourne. And so I used that experience, and over a period of time, supported very strongly by one of the legends of Australian basketball, Lorraine Landon, we actually got government support and fundraised ourselves to build a 7-court stadium at Bankstown. And when we ran short of money at the end of the event, and we didn't have the money to nail the floor down and to surface it, we did it as volunteers. And it's now close to 50 years ago that was. It was opened in 1974 by the Premier of the state. And it's still one of the best floors in Australia. So it was a wonderful experience. Progressively increased to 7 courts overall, and they're desperately looking to expand that now. But that led the way to many other similar developments across the state.
Bob, You mentioned Lindsay Gaze's name. We know that you're going to catch up with Lindsay on this trip that in Melbourne, and we'd ask you to pass on the very best of wishes from the basketball community to Lindsay.
Yeah. No, I do. I have great respect for Lindsay. I mean, he was an enormous help and a role model for me in basketball, and I travelled the world with many times with he and his Melbourne teams and with the Australian teams. And I was the manager of his Boomers team to the 84 Olympic Games and enjoyed every minute of that. And the relationship with Lindsay ever since has been very, very good. And he's a wonderful exponent of the game. And of course, Andrew, his son, I have a close relationship with as well. And it's just a wonderful family.
In this interview series, we caught up recently with Ian Brown, one of the longest-serving members of Myths and Legends, ex-St Kilda player,
yes,
who was at the 1979 meeting in the aircraft hangar in Sydney, in which Dr. John Raschke helped to create the NBL. Ian was taking the minutes at that time, but you were also there. Perhaps you can take us back.
That's right. I was one of the 9 founding directors of the NBL, something I'm very proud of, and I've been very pleased to see the continued growth of the NBL over all these years. I represented the Bankstown Association at the time, the Bankstown Bruins, who later on, of course, realised that we couldn't go it alone, along with Sydney Supersonics, and we combined to become, obviously, Sydney. Became West Sydney and then Super Sydney Supersonics and obviously the Kings ultimately. But it was a wonderful time. I remember that meeting well. John Raschke was very inspirational, and we had different representatives from Adelaide, Melbourne, Canberra, Illawarra, Newcastle, Brisbane. It was a great event. That was the start of it all. So I've had this great love for the league ever since, and I've been very much part of that for many, many years and love what they do.
One of the things that you and other participants in that meeting would have had to come to understand is the real powerhouse that was Melbourne basketball at the time, with Ken Watson and Lindsay Gaze. And of course, accommodating the way that they saw the future was an important juggling act for Dr. John Raschke and others.
Yeah, it was. And because Lindsay and Ken, who were great people for Australian basketball, but they were not supportive initially of the way in which the league was set up, and they actually, Melbourne churches they were now and then, were not part of it, not part of the original 9 teams that competed. And so they were always outside of it, yet they were clearly one of Australia's best clubs and teams. And we held over that time, of course, the Australian Club Championship, which was open to any club team across Australia. And it was played every year in different cities, and Melbourne did very well in that, of course, but ultimately the NBL became so strong when it was formed in 1979 that was the demise and the end of the Australian Club Championship, as it was the end of the competition between states when Victoria was so dominant over those years and had legendary competitions against South Australia and to a lesser degree New South Wales.
Bob, you managed the Australian men's basketball team, the Boomers, in 1982 and 1984 in their overseas trips. Take us back to that time.
Yeah, it was a great period for me. Because Lindsay was the coach, and I had great respect for him. Adrian Hurley was a very close friend of mine over many, many years. I actually coached him in a couple of state teams. He was the captain of one of my New South Wales men's state teams when we were playing in the Australian Championships. And so we went to the Los Angeles Olympics, finished best ever, 7th there, and wonderful group of players. That was the ilk of Andrew Gaze was the rookie, Damien Keogh was the rookie, and we had the likes of Brad Dalton and Ian Davies, just an extraordinary shooter, and some very high quality players. Phil Smythe was part of that group, and it included the 1982 World Championships in Colombia in South America, which was our best ever finish. We finished 7th there and made the finals, which was the final round, and so it was a great experience.
Where was women's basketball in Australia at that time in the early 80s?
Women's basketball has had a good record. The Australian women, the Opals as they're now known, they weren't then, first competed in 1955 at the first FIBA Women's World Basketball Cup in South America, in Chile. And in fact, a team of, I think, about like 8 Australian girls went to that, fundraised themselves, paid their own way, went by boat, took them 3 months to get there. But since that time, the Opals, as we know them and love them now, have grown to be an enormously successful team. And I was very fortunate that my wife, now passed away some 3 years ago, but she was an Opal, played along with two of our very best friends in New South Wales in that 1967 World Championship, coached by Tony Gaze. And they were part of the New South Wales and one of Australia's best women's team at the time, originally known as Barbarians, then Arncliffe Scots, and then the Bankstown Bruins.
Bob, in 1991, you get appointed as General Manager for the Sydney Olympic bid company. Can you take us back to that time and the events leading up to Sydney's bid? Who was on that bid group with you? What were the politics of the day? You're competing against other cities in order to host this largest event in the sport.
So my recollections at that time was a wonderful period of my life, and again, as I come back to the right place at the right time, I had earlier been, through my role in physical education, I left teaching and took up a senior sports role within the Department of Sport and Recreation in New South Wales, first time it had been established in there. And one of the things I got appointed to early on in 1979 was a subcommittee of 5 people chosen by the Premier of the day, Neville Rand, to determine whether we should bid for the 1988 Olympic Games for Sydney. And I served on that committee with John Coates, Phil Coles, people like that. And it was a wonderful experience. Anyhow, the end result was that the government decided not to bid, which was the right decision, because we only had 3 venues in Sydney at the time that could meet Olympic standards. Out of that, Rand, the Premier of the day, gave me the job of creating the new blueprint for international sports facilities in Sydney. Out of that came the establishment of the State Sports Centre, the first truly international sports centre in New South Wales, which I was very much part of the construction team. And then then I managed it for a period of time. And again, one of those situations, Sydney decided to bid for the 2000 Olympic Games. And it just turned out that I had a function at the State Sports Centre where I was the CEO, and it was attended by most of the bid committee, guys like John Coates, Phil Coles, Graham Lovett, and they had just appointed Rod McGeoch, who was the CEO of the bid committee. And again, they were impressed with what I was doing, and they were looking for someone to take responsibility for sport in particular, but bidding generally. And so in a half-hour interview with Rod McGeoch, he said, well, when can you start? And I started a week later. The Sports Centre board released me because they was the same people involved, and I got involved with the bid as the general manager of the bid, reporting to Rod McGeoch. Travelled the world promoting the bid, totally different bidding circumstances those days as to what it is today, and attending world championships in sport all over the world, pushing the case for Sydney and what we would do for the athletes. And it was a wonderful period of 2 years. Continual international travel and slog, and organising a very small team in Sydney to bid for. And of course, we went to Monte Carlo in September of 1993 and won the vote 43 votes to 41, beating off Beijing as it turned out. We were very lucky in those days to have had the support of and that's a separate story in itself, how we had gained the support of enough IOC members to vote for us. And so out of that came the opportunity for Sydney to host the Games. So I managed the transition from the bid to the organising committee, which became the acronym of SOCOG, Sydney Organising Committee for the Olympic Games. And then in time was given the formal role of head of sport, which embraced a whole range of things like athlete services, the village, medical services, doping, international relations, all of that stuff. And again, travelled the world promoting the Sydney Games and working with international sports federations. So we're ultimately able to organise with a wonderful group of staff and volunteers the best ever Olympic Games, according to the then president of the IOC, Juan Antonio Samaranch.
The numbers are just extraordinary. 28 sports, 11,000 athletes, 200 nations, more than 8 million spectators, of course, part of a global television audience. Not only did you deliver the best games ever, but you've maintained a connection through to Olympics that have been hosted in all sorts of other cities around the world. So perhaps you can help us understand that. Yeah,
Sydney, led by, I have to say, the inspiration behind the planning for the Sydney Olympics came from John Coates, the then president of the Australian Olympic Committee, later on to become vice president of the International Olympic Committee, and has just finally retired from that role just recently. And his emphasis at all times was the it had to be athlete driven. We had to be conscious that what we were doing was organising the world's biggest event, sporting event, for the sake of the athletes. Yes, the spectators are important, the broadcasters are important, but the facilities, the services, the volunteers all had to be directed towards meeting the athlete needs. And that was the mantle that we created, and it was well respected. We created a wonderful team of volunteers from all over Australia that came in to support the games, and staff members at SOCOG, and the Paralympics as well were part of that. And I was responsible for leading the bid in the Paralympics for there as well. And it was a wonderful 7 years of my life to spend working in that role through to the most successful games ever, and the most successful and dominant Paralympic games ever.
A games that it's for the athletes is really the centrepiece of the evaluation committee role, which you took on subsequent to the delivery of the games. Tell us about evaluating bids from different countries.
Yes, again, my work on Sydney was well respected by the International Olympic Committee, and the international and their sports head of sport, a guy called Gilbert Felly, a Swiss Frenchman. And he and I had a great relationship, and they then asked would I become a member of their evaluation teams, because they then had a team that would go to evaluate all of the bids. And I actually also worked as a consultant for the IOC in the whole area of sport. And it was a wonderful time. I was part of the bid team that, for the 2004 Olympic Games, where Athens, and for Beijing for 2008, and then London 2012. So they were wonderful times, part of a wonderful team, and travelled the world visiting all of those cities and advising them. And along the way also that future host cities had seen what I had done with Sydney and with the IOC, so Beijing appointed me as their first international consultant for the 2008 Olympic Games. And then London did the same for 2012. And, it was a period of time when I had, again through John Coates, been offered, and I certainly took the role of full-time with the Australian Olympic Committee after the Sydney Olympics. And that led to, I was head of sport there and international relations, but then I quickly moved into the Secretary-General's role when Craig McCutcheon left, and continued that through to 2004, when I could see that it was a clash of time and interest when I was also an international consultant. So I retired from the AOC. But John Coates was a remarkable supporter to me in those days.
Your success in the Sydney Olympics, but also the work that you've done around evaluating other and supporting the delivery of other Olympic Games puts you on FIBA's radar. And you start with the President of Oceania role. Tell us about that.
Yes, I was very involved in basketball in the 60s onwards, and there was a former guy. I credit three people having enormous influence in my basketball career, and that's Al Ramsey, who was the first Secretary of Basketball Australia and was the person responsible for Australia winning the right and Oceania winning the right to be its own zone, passed at the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. So Al Ramsey there, Bruce Flick from the coaching side of things in basketball, and Lindsay Gaze from the point of view of facilities and what I could do to help grow the sport. And also John Rask, as I mentioned, for his enthusiasm for how to grow the sport and what he had done in Newcastle. And so, with that sort of background, Ramsey had come. I dropped out of all basketball for the period of the Sydney Olympic bid and then the Games, because I needed to identify with all sports, that I was open to all sports and not just basketball. But as the Sydney Olympics came to an end, Ramsey came to me and said, I want you to now come back into basketball and become involved in Oceania. And I became the president of Oceania basketball a year after I left the Olympics. And that led to becoming appointed vice president of FIBA. And then 4 years later, president of FIBA for 4 years. So wonderful time.
Between 2006 and 2010, what were the most significant achievements of your time there?
My most challenging role, and in particular my most pleasant role, was establishing the House of Basketball. FIBA had previously lived in rented facilities in many different countries. And in 1968, at that same Congress in Mexico, that Mexico City, that had decided to create status to Oceania. They also said FIBA should have its own house, but nothing had ever happened. So together with the late Secretary General Patrick Baumann, when I became president, we set about finding the land, gaining government support, and then convincing the federations to back us, because the headquarters of FIBA in those days were in Germany, in Munich, been there for many years. And we were successful. We got the government of Switzerland to support us, the local cantons. Baumann and I visited probably 30 to 40 different sites in and around Switzerland, everywhere we could. Agreed that Switzerland was the right place to start, because it was the home of international sport, home of the International Olympic Committee. And out of all that became the opportunity, which I led the development then of the $50 million home of basketball for FIBA, which is now a great acquisition. They've now fully paid off all the loans, and it's just a wonderful institution for basketball. It has its own 3x3 court and its own 3x3 tournament every year. So the next step should be a Masters World Tournament there.
Of course, at that time, the sport's really becoming increasingly globalised. So what contribution did FIBA make to that globalisation and expansion of basketball across various continents and countries?
I think what happened, when I think back, is there were a number of factors, George. One was, in particular, that FIBA developed a very close working relationship with the NBA, which continues to this day. And I had many, many meetings with the then head of NBA, David Stern, and we had a great relationship, and now since that, Adam Silver. And that's continued all the way along, that relationship. And so that relationship, together with the growth of the sport in different countries, and FIBA's objective in wanting to grow the whole sport, mini basketball for the school-aged children through the others, and giving an increased emphasis for women's basketball was helped as well, and progressively improving our standing within the International Olympic Committee by the staging of very, very successful Olympic basketball tournaments, which of course Australia's been part of very much.
When we look at the sort of parallel development in Australia, we understand what was going on globally, but what happened in Australia during your time as president of FIBA globally?
Yeah, I mean, the sport's been growing very, very well in Australia. I mean, yeah, we were extraordinarily beneficial of what happened in the 60s when, because of the shortage of teachers in Australia, and physical education teachers being one of them, we had a scheme operating where we were able to invite American qualified teachers, but also basketball players, to come and join our program here. So the Brian Gorgens of this world is a great example of it. Henry Daigle, many, many others, and all of the great American basketballers at that time came through that system. Perry Crosswhite and many, many others like that. And they really helped grow from the early 60s, grow the quality of our sport, the strength of our sport, and we then were progressively able to have increasingly strong international teams. And from 1964 on, when we qualified for the first time at the Tokyo Olympics, we've had, apart from Mexico, apart from 1968, Mexico City, where we didn't qualify, we've had a remarkable record in the men's basketball ever since, and the women's basketball from Montreal onwards has been a success as well. But it was all driven by the shortage of teachers in the 60s, and basketball was able to take advantage of that.
What kind of shape do you think basketball in Australia is right now, starting off with boomers and opals?
Well, I think, Australia punches way above its weight at the international level. I mean, we're ranked probably fifth, in the role of 5th to 8th in men's basketball, 2nd in women's, 2nd and 3rd in junior men's and women's basketball. So across all federations and all levels of the sport, we're ranked about 4th in the world. And it's a remarkable effort for a country of such a small population. But we've done very well because we're passionate about the sport, and anything Australians do, they attempt to do well. So we've had world-class referees officiating at the Olympic Games. We've had world-class coaches, and led by Lindsay Gaze, who's extraordinarily respected by the American and the international sports community, and that's why he's in the FIBA Hall of Fame. And so now basketball in Australia is at a very high level. We still don't have the major commercial support necessary that, let's say, football does, or rugby league, or lesser degree soccer, football. But at the same time, of course, the roles of the National Basketball League for the men and the Women's National Basketball League, two of the longest standing leagues in the world, have had an enormous impact on the growth of the sport in Australia.
Perhaps I can ask you to reflect on that, Bob. What shape do you think the NBL and the WNBL are in, and what do they need to be thinking about moving forward?
Well, the NBL, as we talked about earlier, was formed in 1979, led by John Raskey, who was a visionary at the time. And throughout the 70s and the late 70s, 80s, it really boomed. And then it dropped off for whatever reason, we don't know, but lack of probably the right attention, struggled to get commercial support, struggled to get the right people in place to run the game. Meanwhile, but now it's soared to whole new levels. The introduction by Larry Kesselman into the role as owner of the league and the inspiration behind its growth has been remarkable. And he's had a tremendous influence on the success of the NBL. Case of the women, longest serving women's sports league in Australia, maybe close to it in the world. I mean, well into their 40th years now. But they do it financially in a very difficult manner. And so the next step for the WNBL is now about to take place, where a new consortium led by Larry Kesselman and led by Robin Denholm, a highly qualified and very successful businesswoman, both Australians, have joined forces with Basketball Australia and others to create a new model for the WNBL. And we're all very hopeful that will now take off in a dramatic form.
If I could ask you to come down one level, what needs to happen at the local association and stadium level? Here in Victoria, we have a current deficit of 250 courts. We could fill 250 courts with leagues and competitions if they were there. Given your background in, I guess, facilities, construction and development, what needs to happen in order to get that part of the equation right?
Well, it's symbolic of the growth of the sport. I mean, I've been extraordinarily impressed with what has happened in Victorian basketball in the growth of facilities, led by Lindsay Gaze throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s. Wayne Bird has had a role in that more recently, and now the current Victorian basketball have reached wonderful relationships with the Victorian government. You know, we've seen the dramatic improvement and increase at Knox, for example, and places like Casey and Werribee and other venues that I've visited, compared to when in my earlier coaching days, I brought teams to Nunawading and to Knox, and or not Knox so much, but the old Melbourne Basketball Centre, but New South Wales, my home state, and I've been on the board there, and I was president for a 4-year period recently. It's desperately short of facilities, and as is elsewhere, and so getting government support has been very challenging. And I have to say, Lindsay led the way, and as does the Victorian Basketball Association very much in that regard now. Western Australia are doing well. They've just the government's just announced a huge grant to relocate the Wildcats and the women's program to substantial new facilities, upgrade, and new stadiums being built over there. I have a daughter who lives over there, so I travel to Perth quite often and always visit a basketball stadium somewhere. But we don't have the government support nationally that, let's say, a sport like Australian rules football does or rugby league does. And so time will tell. I mean, we desperately need more facilities.
In your roles at FIBA, you're able to look at where government is really behind basketball and the countries that do it well. Yeah. So perhaps you could talk about some of those countries where there's significant support, financial and other, for the sport.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Amongst the most successful basketball countries in the world are some of the smallest basketball countries. I mean, Serbia, where you have strong relationships too, and which was the former Yugoslavia, but Lithuania, Croatia, Slovenia, small populations, remarkable basketball standards. The Philippines, you know, passionate about basketball, is the number one sport in the Philippines. And now we're seeing the growth in India. Watch India and Indonesia grow in our region in the next few years to come, given the population they have, and as they start to spend some money on facilities. But again, the demand for facilities is everywhere, and so we need more and more, and the only way those facilities can be built these days is by government support. So the sport, basketball, our sport, needs to do a job of continuing to convince governments of the value of investing in sports facilities for basketball and other indoor sports that will improve the health of the nation and get young kids off their phones and off their PCs and their games out into a healthy environment.
Bob, you stepped down as global president of FIBA in the year 2010. What followed?
I then, again, as part of the development of the FIBA House I talked about earlier, we also created the FIBA Foundation, which was like a not-for-profit organisation as part of FIBA, but to help grow the sport in the less developed countries of the world in particular. And I was the inaugural president of that, so I served as president of that from 2010 to 2014. And I continue with FIBA now as a role of honorary president, which is more symbolic than anything else. I attend their congresses and kept informed about the activities. But the important thing is that the growth continues, and we've got some great Australians still active within the FIBA circle. David Reid out of Newcastle, a lawyer, former member of the Basketball Australia board, an active basketballer himself, a Masters basketball player in Newcastle. He is currently the FIBA Vice President and will probably become the next FIBA President. Become the second Australian. I was the first Australian ever to be President of FIBA, so David will follow in that role, I think. And there are other Australians playing remarkable roles at the international level as well.
You mentioned the FIBA Foundation. I haven't had a chance to brief you on this, but of course you are aware that there's a group of activists in Masters Basketball in Australia that's called itself AMBA, or the Australasian Masters Basketball Association. And earlier this week, Philippe Guspula in FIBA in Switzerland advised that they would embed a youth that would be selected by the FIBA Foundation to support our efforts in trying to develop Masters basketball here in Australia. Wow. So that's almost like a mentorship, but on the administration side of things. How do we create and develop the program here and then create a legacy by making sure that a FIBA Foundation appointed youth person is part of that journey and that story?
Yeah, that's wonderful news. I mean, a driving force behind the success of the foundation these days is the former president of Oceania who succeeded me, in Burton Shipley from New Zealand. And he's a member of the FIBA board, executive board, but he's also on the foundation. And it's doing some wonderful work in less developed countries. So the fact that Australia can help in that regard will be a remarkable opportunity for us and for FIBA, and for particularly in the master sport movement. As you know, we've got such a strong movement in Australia. We now need to try and help translate that movement globally in the less developed countries of basketball and create a competition pathway.
Bob, we fall in love with different players and teams along the way. If you think back over all of the years that you've been watching the development of basketball in Australia, both domestically and on the world stage, who are your favourite players?
I'll get a few offside there. I had enormous respect, and still do to this day, for Phil Smythe. He was the captain of the Boomers during the period I was with them for that 1980 to 1984 period. I recall we played in the World Championships in 1982 in Colombia in very difficult circumstances. Phil was very, very sick. I was taking him to hospital every second day as the manager. But he continued to play and played remarkable roles where we had our best ever performance there. So he stands out in my memory as one of the greats. And, a number of the other guys that have continued their role in basketball, Ray Borner, Wayne Carroll, Larry Sengstock, these sorts of guys, played, Andy Blickovs, have played wonderful roles and continue to do so, as does Andrew Gaze. Look at Andrew's role and what he's done now to grow the popularity and be such a great spokesman for the sport. And of course in the girls as well, we've had some remarkable females there. We're none better than Lauren Jackson, regarded as the best female basketballer in the world.
Well, of course, you're on Michelle Tim's territory. This is Bulleen, and not far from here is the Sheehan's Road Stadium, where Michelle played a lot of her early games, and she still runs her Michelle Tim's Basketball Academy about 10 minutes from here in Mullen. But between Lauren and Michelle, there's certainly two of the sort of highest profile opals and captains that we've ever had.
Well, when you think about it, like the FIBA Hall of Fame is is not that old in its physical nature. It's now part of the House of Basketball in a little village called Mies, just outside of Geneva. And a number of Australians that have been inducted into that is quite extraordinary, Michelle being one of them. I mean, Lindsay Gaze was the first, but then since that, Andrew Gaze and Andrew Bogut is about to be instigated into that Hall of Fame in the next month or so. And then, of course, Robin Ma, Tom Ma, Michelle Timms, remarkable participants and levels of involvement and support by the international community for the basketball greats of Australia.
Bob, your list of achievements is very long. Basketball New South Wales Hall of Fame, Basketball Australia Hall of Fame. You picked up an OAM, I think, in 2022. When you go back and you think about some of those accolades and achievements, are there any great stories that come to mind?
Well, I think, the awards are all nice and they're recognised and so on, but it's my passion for the game, I guess, and what I've contributed, I think, is a passion and a leadership. I think I'm known for my strong leadership and my commitment. I mean, I'm very committed to the sport and its overall success. And so I don't just singularly want the men to succeed or the women to succeed. I'm now passionate also, of course, about the success of Masters basketball, and I hope that can go to new heights within FIBA and within Australia. And generally, I've been very fortunate to, through my involvement with the Olympic movement and with basketball, to have travelled the world. I mean, I've been to more than 100 countries around the world and been entertained. My grandkids love me telling them stories of where I've been to as part of the Olympic Evaluation and Coordination Commissions, where I had dinner with the Queen in England and Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and sat next to Michael Jordan in USA. These sorts of stories. So I've had a wonderful life in that regard, but I'm very grateful for what basketball has done for me. I'm only sad I didn't get to play when I was young.
Now, Bob, you mentioned at the outset of this interview that you're retired, but blokes like you never really retire. You're very connected with what's going on. Perhaps take us inside of life outside of basketball and start off by talking about family.
Yeah, well, regrettably, my wife, as I mentioned earlier, who was an opal, died 3 years ago, and she was very, very active in basketball in New South Wales and has been honoured in the Hall of Fame in New South Wales as well. My two kids, my son Brent, captain New South Wales and junior basketball teams, playing at the national championships in under 16 and under 18 age groups, and is still passionate about the sport. If there's a Masters event somewhere, he'll go and play in it, for sure.
We've got a jersey in his size, no problems.
My daughter's the non-basketball one. She was a referee in the younger days because my wife at the time, Maureen, worked within the staff at Bankstown Basketball, managed all the accounts. Our kids grew up in the stadium, a bit like Andrew Gaze growing up at in the old Melbourne Olympic Park next to Court 9 there. And so my daughter has a great love for the sport, but has never really got involved in it. But they're in Perth, and they keep an active role. They're Kings supporters, like I am. I'm a foundation member of the Kings, and so we'll continue to support the Kings. And my son's a passionate Kings supporter, and I have to say a passionate Collingwood supporter, which I give him a hard time for. That's another story.
Grandchildren?
Yeah. I'm very lucky. I've got 6 beautiful grandchildren, 5 girls and a boy. And they're all in the age group now, the 18 through 25, and I love spending time with them, and they all love some of the stories I can tell them about my travels around the world and what I've done and things like this. And I think they're very proud of the role that I've played in sport generally and in the community, and now how in turn I'm trying to help them find a way in life as well and support them as much in the same way.
Bob, your health's good, you're in good shape. Tell me about how you look after yourself.
Well, I was always a runner, as I said earlier, and so I continued to run. I sort of don't run too much these days. I try to walk every day. And I certainly try to live in a healthy manner. I'm sort of this is a positive thing about losing my wife is I've had to learn to cook. So, and I'm passionate about cooking and enjoying it. I'm a Rick Stein fan, and a recent trip to England I went out and found his restaurant in Padstow in Cornwall, and enjoyed seeing what goes on there. But and my friends all laugh at me because I have my pink Rick Stein shirt. But so food's become very important, and I love what's going on in the Australian dining scene. I'm great respect for what happens there, and I'm testing some of that out while I'm here in Melbourne.
Of course. Bob, I'm a big believer in that we shouldn't live our lives with any regret, and so there's no need for you to regret not playing basketball. We have a spot for you in any number of Myths and Legends teams at lots of tournaments whenever you're ready.
Yeah, we've got a couple of, in Sydney, a couple of very good friends who, in fact, a couple of them play with Myths and Legends and others play with Bankstown, my old association, where I'm the life member and honorary president there. They continue to promote a Masters competition in a strong group, and we're trying to see that grows through other associations as well in New South Wales, as what you're doing. I mean, Myths and Legends are a remarkable role model for the Masters basketball movement in Australia, so let's hope the other states can do something similar.
Yeah, we're trying to engage some of those other states, and we've got a delegation of people now in New South Wales that have come together and articulated the state of play, what's going on currently, what we'd like to see, and they're very, very prepared and able to get involved.
And I think, I think Adelaide have got some remarkable players of yesteryear that all would continue to want to play, and they all meet regularly. As in the case of West Australia as well, I think there's quite a strong movement there. So it'll take time, but we need to give it some emphasis. And I'm really pleased with. One of the things I tried to do as president was unsuccessful, was to create a World Masters movement in basketball. And now that is now being taken up by FIBA and moving in that direction. So I hope that will progress the scene quite dramatically.
Well, we're tremendously excited about that. But otherwise, delighted to have spent some time with you today. We wanted to wish you all the very best of health and otherwise best of luck in your future endeavours.
And thank you for what your club, Myths and Legends, do for Masters basketball. And I mean, it's just, Masters sport is so important for the health of the nation and acts as an inspiration for others to get involved. So well done, George.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Take care. Good.